Hello students, I am Raghavendra Kumar Singh, faculty of US Academy and Institute. Today we will discuss class 10th History's third chapter, The Making of a Global World. Globalization means integration of markets in the global economy, leading to the increased interconnectedness of a national economy. By having an idea of the history of globalization, we should understand the causes which led to such social and economical changes. The 19th century industrial revolution was one of the significant periods in the history of globalization. The pre-modern world. Globalization refers to an economical system that has emerged since the last 50 years or so. But the making of the global world has a long history of trade, of migration, of peoples in search of work, the movement of capital, and much else. From ancient times, travelers, traders, priests, and pilgrims traveled vast distance for knowledge, opportunities, and spiritual fulfillment, or to escape persecution as early as 3000 BCE. An active coastal trade linked the Indus Valley civilization with present-day West Asia. Now the Silk Route linked the world. Silk Route are a good example of vibrant pre-modern trade and cultural links between distant parts of the world. Several Silk Routes have been identified by historians. Overland and by sea, connecting vast regions of Asia and linking Asia with Europe and North America. In exchange of textiles and species from India, precious metals, gold and silver, flowed from Europe to Asia. Now, food travels, spaghetti and potato. Food offers many examples of long-distance cultural exchanges. New crops were introduced by traders and travelers. Ready foodstuffs such as noodles traveled vast from China to become spaghetti. Our ancestors were not familiar with common foods such as potatoes, soya, groundnuts, maize, tomatoes, chilies, sweet potatoes, and so on. About 5 centuries ago, many of our common foods came from America's origin inhabitants, the American Indians. Now, the conquest, disease, and trades. The Indian Ocean from centuries before had known a bustling trade with goods, people, knowledge, custom, etc., crisscrossing its waters. The entry of Europeans helped in redirecting these flows towards Europe. America's vast lands and abundant crops, minerals began to transform trade and lives everywhere. The Portuguese and Spanish conquest and colonization of America was decisively underway by the mid-16th century. Europeans' most powerful weapon was not a conventional military weapon, but germs, such as those of smallpox that they carried on their person. It proves to be a deadly killer. Until the 19th century, poverty and hunger were common in Europe. Until Into the 18th century, China and India were among the world's richest countries. However, from the 15th century, China is said to be restricted overseas contacts and retreated into isolation. Europe now emerged as the center of world trade. Now, the 19th century, 1815 to 1914. In 19th century, economical, political, social, cultural, and technological factors interacted in complexes way to transform societies and reshape internal relations. Three flows or movements were identified by economists. The first is the flow of trade, referred largely to trade in goods, for example, clothes or wheat. The second is the flow of labor, the migration of peoples in search of employment. The third is the movement of capital for short term or long term investment over long distance. Now the word economy takes shape. In the 19th century, self-sufficient in food meant lower living standard and social conflict in Britain. It happened because of population growth from the late 18th century. Corn law were imposed, which means restriction in the import of corn. The British agriculture was unable to compete with import, and vast areas of land were left uncultivated. So thousands of men and women flocked to the cities or migrated overseas. In Britain, food prices fell, and in the mid 19th century, industrial growth led to higher incomes and more food imports in order to fulfill British demands. In Eastern Europe, Russia, America, and Australia, lands were cleared to expand food production in order to manage linking of railways to agricultural fields and building homes from people's required capital and labor. London helped in terms of finance and terms of labor. People immigrated from Europe to America and Australia in the 19th century. By 1890, a global agricultural economy had taken shape, adapting complex changes in labor movement pattern, capital flows, ecologies, and technology. In West Punjab, the British Indian government built a network of irrigation canals to transform semi-desert wastes into the fertile agricultural lands to grow wheat and cotton for export. Even the cultivation of cotton expanded worldwide to feed British textile mills. Now, the role of technology. Some of the important inventions in the field of technology are the railway, steamships, the telegraph, which transformed the 19th century world. But technologically, advances were often the result of larger social, political, and economical factors. For example, colonization stimulated new investments and improvements in trade, transport. Faster railways, lighter wagons, and larger ships helps move food more cheaply and quickly from far away farms to final markets. Animals were also shipped live from America to Europe till the 1870s. Meat was considered an expensive luxury beyond the reach of the European poor. To break the earlier monotony of bread and potatoes, many could not add meat and butter and egg to their diet. Now, the late 19th century, colonialism. Trade flourished and markets expanded in the late 19th century, but it has a darker side too. As in many parts of the world, the expansion of trade and a closer relationship with the world economy meant a loss of freedoms and livelihood. In 1885, the big European powers met in Berlin to complete the carving up of Africa between them. Britain and France made vast additions to their overseas territories. Belgium and Germany became new colonial powers. The US also became a colonial power in the late 1890s by taking over some colonies earlier held by Spain. Now, Rinderpest or the cattle plague. In Africa, in the 1890s, a vast spreading disease of cattle plague impacted people's livelihood and the local economy. Africa had abundant land and a relatively small population. In the late 19th century, Europeans were attracted to Africa due to its vast resources of land and minerals. Europeans came to Africa hoping to establish plantation and mines to produce crop and minerals for export to Europe. But there was an unexpected problem: a shortage of labor willing to work for wages. Inheritance laws were changed, and accordingly to the new one, only one member of a family was allowed to inherit land. In the late 1880s, Rinderpest arrived in Africa, carried by infected cattle imported from British Asia to feed the Italians. Soldiers invading Eritrea in East Africa. The loss of cattle destroyed African livelihood. Now, indentured labor migration from India. Indentured labor illustrates the two-sided nature of the 19th century world, a world of faster economic growth as well as great misery, higher income for some and poverty for others, technological advance in some areas and new forms of coercion in others. In India, indentured laborers were hired under contract, and most of them came from the present-day region of eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, central India, and the dry district of Tamil Nadu. India indentured migrant main destination were the Caribbean islands, mainly Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, Mauritius, and Fiji. Indentured workers were also recruited for tea plantation in Assam. 19th century indenture have been described as a new system of slavery. In Trinidad, the annual Muharram procession was transformed into a riotous carnival called Jose, in which workers of all races and religions joined. Similarly, the protest religion of Rastafarianism is said to reflect social and cultural links with Indian migrants to the Caribbean. From the 19 double knot, India's nationalist leader began opposing the system of indentured labor migration as abusive and cruel. It was abolished in 1921. Now, Indian entrepreneur abroad. Peoples need huge capital to grow food and other crops for the world market. So, for the humble peasants, Sikaripuri, Sroff, and Nathukotai Chetiyar were amongst the many groups of bankers and traders who financed export agriculture in Central and Southeast Asia using either their own funds or those borrowed from European banks. Now, Indian trade, colonialism, and the global system. Cotton from India were exported to Europe. In Britain, tariffs were imposed on clothes imports. Consequently, the inflow of fine Indian cotton began to decline. Over the 19th century, British manufactured flooded the Indian market by helping Britain balance its deficits. India plays a crucial role in the late 19th century world economy. Britain trade surplus in India also helped pay the so-called home charges. That includes private remittance home by British officials and trade, interest payments on India's external debt, and pensions of British officials in India. Then, the interwar economy. The First World War in 1914 to 1918 was fought in Europe, but its impacts were felt around the world. During this period, the world experiences widespread economic and political instability and another catastrophic war. Wartime transformation. The First World War was fought between the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, later joined by the US, and the Central Power, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. The war lasted for more than 4 years, which involves the world's leading industrial nation. It was considered as the first modern industrial war, which saw the use of machine guns, tanks, aircraft, chemical weapons, etc. On the massive scale, during the war, industries were restructured to produce war-related goods. Britain borrowed large sums of money from US banks as well as the US public, transforming the US from being an international debtor to the international creditors. Now, post-war recovery. Post-war economic recovery, Britain, the world-leading economy, faced a prolonged crisis. Industries had developed in India and Japan, while Britain was preoccupied in the war. Britain, after the war, found it difficult to recapture its earlier position of dominance in the Indian market and to compete with Japan internationally. At the end of the war, Britain was burdened with the huge external debts, anxiety, and uncertainty about work became an enduring part of the post-war scenario. Now, the rise of mass production and consumption. The US economy recovered quicker and resumed its strong growth in the early 1920s. Mass productions in one of the important features of the US economy, which began in the late 19th century. Henry Ford is a well-known pioneer of mass production, a car manufacturer who established his car plant in Detroit. The T-model Ford was the world's first mass-produced car. Fordist industrial practices soon spread in the US and were also copied in Europe in the 1920s. The demand for refrigerators, washing machines, etc. also boomed, financed once again by loans. In 1923, the US resumed exporting capital to the rest of the world and became the largest overseas lender. Now, the Great Depression. Period of the Great Depression began around 1929 and lasted till the mid of 1930. Most part of the world experienced catastrophic decline in production, employment, income, and trade. The most affected areas were agricultural region and communities. Combination of several factors led to depression. The first factor is agriculture overproduction. Second is the mid 1920s. Many countries financed their investments through loans from the US. The rest of the world is affected by the withdrawal of US loan in different ways. The US was also severely affected by depression. Unfortunately, the US banking system collapsed as thousands of banks went bankrupt and were forced to close. Now, India and the Great Depression. Indian trade in immediately affected by depression. The prices of agriculture fell sharply, but still, the colonial government refused to reduce revenue demands. In those depression years, India became an exporter of precious metals, notably gold. Rural India was thus seething with unrest when Mahatma Gandhi launched the civil disobedience movement at the height of the depression in 1931. Now, rebuilding a world economy, the post-war era. 2 decades after the end of the First World War, the Second World War broke. It was fought between the Axis power, mainly Nazi Germany, Japan and Italy, and the Allies, means the Britain, France, the Soviet Union and the US. The war continued for 6 years over land, on seas, in the air. The war caused an immense amount of economic devastation and social disruption. Post-war reconstruction was shaped by 2 crucial influences. The first one is that the US emerged as the dominant economic, political and military power in the Western world. And the second was the dominance of the Soviet Union. Now, the post-war settlement and the Bretton Woods Institution. Two key lessons were drawn out from interwar economic experience. First, mass production cannot be sustained without mass communication. The second lesson related to the country economic links with the outside world. The Bretton Woods Conference established the International Monetary Fund to deal with the external surpluses and deficit of its members' nation. The International Banks for Reconstruction and Development, popularly known as the World Bank, was set up to finance post-war reconstruction. The IMF and the World Bank recommenced financial operation in 1947. Now, the early post-war years. An era of unprecedented growth of trade and incomes was inaugurated by the Bretton Woods from the Western industrial nation and Japan. During these decades, technology and enterprise were spread worldwide. Decolonization and independence. After the end of the Second World War, large part of the world were still under European colonial rule. The IMF and the World Bank were designed to meet the financial needs of the industrial countries. The IMF and the World Bank from the late 1950s shifted their attention more towards developing countries. Most developing countries were not benefited from the fast growth the Western economic experience in the 1950s and 1960s. They organized as a group, the Group of 77 or G77, and demanded a new international economical order, meant a system that would give the real control over their natural resources and more development assistance, fairer prices for raw minerals, and better access for their manufactured goods in developed countries market. Now, the end of Bretton Woods and the beginning of globalization. The US finance and competitive strength were weakened due to rising cost of its overseas involvements from the 1960s. In the mid 1970s, the international financial system also changed, and industrial world was also hit by unemployment. MNCs began to shift their production to low-wage Asian countries. China became attractive destination for investment by foreign MNCs. In the last 2 decades, the world economic geography has been transformed as countries such as India, China, and Brazil have undergone rapid economical transformation.